All right, hi folks. This is Scott Powell once again, the historian and teacher at Knowable World. This is our ongoing student interview series that I hope you've been catching on our YouTube channel. We've had interviews on the history of China and on the history of Japan. And now we have a new series coming up here on the history of India. And Mikaela's been regaling us with her awareness of these important cultures. We're studying Asia, Africa, and the world we live in at Knowable World. We just, in fact, finished the academic year. We've got Memorial Day coming up. And so we've covered China, Japan, the Islamic world, India, and sub-Saharan Africa. You can't find this with any other history program. And the other thing that you can't find with any other history program for homeschoolers or for anybody else is the present-centric approach to history that we take at Knowable World. For those of you adults out there that are interested in it, you can read my book, The History of Now, and the sequel, The History of Tomorrow, and that will give you some insight into the approach. The key is that we treat history as not merely as the study of the past, but rather as the revelation and explanation of the world we live in. So, Mikaela, you know the drill. In order to initiate the proper study of any historical topic, we need to get our mind wrapped around the fact that it's the world we want to understand and India's role in it that we want to understand. So, what's the world we live in, for starters?
The world we live in is an interconnected agglomeration of nearly 200 countries that can be broken up into 10 major cultural blocks, 5 of which are cardinal cultures, in which the United States has primacy.
Okay, folks, I want you to notice the hierarchy of that. The 200, which is a plethora that most people get stuck with rote memorizing. And then we have these 10 cultural blocks that we can organize it into. And I'll show you a map to give you a little clue as to how that works. And then there's 5 cardinal cultures. Mikaela, remind people what we mean by that.
A cardinal culture is a culture that has a certain level of influence over history. To break it down simply, they are a culture with both the will to change the world and the capability to.
Okay. And then we have American primacy, the fact that everybody out there, of course, has to deal with, right? All the cultures of the world, whether it's Russia invading Ukraine or Israel fighting for its survival against Hamas or China pondering the possibility of invading Taiwan, everybody always has to ask themselves, what will America do? And India, where does India sit within the hierarchy of these 200, the 10, the 5, the 1?
India is a major culture.
Okay, and so not quite cardinal culture. Just give us a little bit of an explanation of where India sits in terms of, let's actually start with an anchor fact, right? Because that's our approach. The present-centric method of history centers around anchor facts. So India, what's our first anchor fact for studying the history of India today? And what kind of culture is it ever since that milestone?
First anchor fact is 1947, where India gained independence from Britain. Alongside, there was the partition of India and Pakistan. This has led the culture to be post-colonial in the modern day.
Okay, so let's talk post-colonial. What is that? Because we've talked about post-Maoist China. It used to be Maoist, is no longer. We've talked about post-imperial. Japan used to be an empire, is no longer. Okay, so post-colonial in a way is pretty straightforward, but talk a little bit about that.
Well, post-colonial is after being part of a colony, but what specifically is displayed in it is that they are in the period of being after a colony, but they do not have anything else besides that, despite the fact that they have been independent for, what's the math, 80 plus years?
Yeah,
Not 80.
nearly 80 years, right? Okay. And so post-colonial also, whenever we're in a post framework with regard to a culture, what we mean is it was something and it hasn't quite defined an identity yet. Is India trying to define a new identity? What's it working towards?
Yes, India is very much attempting to define an identity based on their Hindu culture, and they're trying to hone it through Hinduva or Hindu nationalism.
All right. That's tricky though, because is there such a thing as Hinduism?
No, there is not, because the idea of Hinduism is an exonym. It is an idea that we impose onto India from the West, that we like to have these isms, which are integrated sets of ideas. But Hinduism, in and of itself, is not integrated. It encompasses such a wide spectrum of beliefs and practices that it is not something that we can impose that sort of definition onto, because that all takes root in their early history of having a unintegrated Hindu culture.
Okay, so to help people that are not familiar with Hinduism, I think the best way to arrive at just an initial understanding of what Hindu culture is, because it's not Hinduism, is to compare it to ancient Greece. Because the ancient Greeks did not have an integrated set of religious beliefs. What they had was a pantheon of gods: Zeus, Athena, Apollo, Poseidon, and so on, and all kinds of different rituals as practiced by a variety of city-states. And India is very much the same way. In other words, it's a collection, a miscellany of small cultures that never really became one culture. And so there is no Hinduism. In fact, the Supreme Court of India actually made the definitive statement on this point and said there is no such thing as Hinduism. Hindu culture is a way of life, and it is a very broad spectrum of beliefs. So if you want to build a Hindu nation, you're going to have trouble doing that on the basis of Hindu culture. But there are other factors as well, right? So we're going to talk about political history, but one of the things that reflects that is the incredible diversity of India. It's hard for people to grasp. It's a very large place. Most projections have a tendency to exaggerate the geographical size of things in the Northern Hemisphere. People ascribe all kinds of reasons to that, but it's not really important. It just makes it hard for us to understand how big and diverse India is. How about linguistically? That's a really interesting clue right there, right? So what is India in terms of a nation when it comes to a language? That's one of the most fundamental things that binds a nation together, is everybody speaks the same language. Is that the case in India?
No, well, sort of. As for accounting for native Indian languages, there are so many that you can barely even count them all. Depending on which region you go to, you will encounter a different language, and generally it's kind of a mess in that regard. But when accounting for the language that they all speak, they're not very satisfied with it because it's not one of their own native Indian languages. It is English, which originates from their time of being a British colony.
Right, exactly. So this is another issue when it comes to the post-colonial predicament of India, that basically the only language that's widely spoken across India is English, the colonial language. So do you build a culture around that? I mean, you have to, in a sense, you have to build it around democracy. India has the most people of any country in the world, more than China, and it's growing rapidly, whereas China is shrinking. So this is a very complex place. I'm just going to pin this down for our listeners here. In fact, India, by some accounts, has a total of 1,652 distinct languages and 22 major languages that are spoken by tens of millions of people. And those are distinct. So try to imagine it's as easily as diverse as Europe in terms of major languages, and much more diverse in terms of dialects and sub-languages and so on. So how do you build a nation out of that? Well, let's talk about that now, Mikaela, because okay, you don't have an integrated set of religious beliefs. You don't have a language that you can build your nation on. So Hindutva says we're going to have a Hindu culture. Oh, but wait a minute. Also, what are the other factors? What would a culture normally build its national identity on in light of previously having been colonized? What would it be based on?
It would be based on their original incarnation that they were before being colonized.
Okay, as we're going to learn now, right, because we're going to dive into that history, it can't be done. So when we circle back around to this, we're going to see why India has been struggling for nearly 80 years now to define a new national identity and path forward, and what's holding it back. Because as the most populous nation in the world, as a nuclear power, as a country that it's really starting to become economically very significant. We don't yet have a made in India revolution to match that of made in China, but nonetheless, it's emerging, and India seems to be forging a pretty positive relationship with the Trump administration. So there are signs that economically India could really emerge as a very important part of the world. But in order to have a united culture, one of the things you got to rely on is your history. So, Mikaela, let's now go back to what should we call it? We call it the second egg effect because we always start with the present. But, that fundamental datum of Indian history is what? And why is this going to be such a liability to creating a national culture?